Hi and welcome to part 2 of this video series about looking at the code for the pre-release material from 2015. Okay, now in task 2, which is what we're looking at now, the examiner asked us to calculate the average. Okay, so in task 1 we were asked to input 30 midday temperatures, if you remember rightly, and 30 midnight temperatures. And if you remember rightly, we stored those in an array. Okay, well, two arrays. One array called midday and one array called midnight. Now, our job today then, in task 2, is to calculate the average. All right. Now, to do that, I've created 4 variables, which are here. So these are my 4 variables, and I've declared them. All right. So they're declared as doubles. Okay. So I've declared them as doubles. Because they're going to be used to store decimal numbers. And if you think about that, if I'm working out an average, I'm going to be doing a divide. Anytime there's some division, there's a chance I might end up with decimal numbers. Okay, so I'm just making sure I'm staying safe and using doubles here. Okay, so the way to work out the average, if you remember your maths, is to calculate the total first. Then divide it by the number of entries, or the number of values, all right, and that calculates the average. We can say the average equals the total divided by the number of entries, or the number of data items. So in this case, I've got a variable here to calculate the midday total. I've got a variable here to calculate the midnight total. And obviously to calculate the average, which I'm going to store in here, I'm going to divide those totals by 30. Okay, so what I'm going to start with is the code here, and as you can see, what I've got here is a for loop. Okay, now why have I used a for loop and not a while loop? Well, hopefully you can answer this, but just to make sure, just in case you can't, I've used a for loop because I know how many times I want to loop. Okay, so in this case I want to loop 30 times. Because I want to loop 30 times and I know how many times I want to loop, I use a for loop. Alright, if I didn't know how many times it was going to end up looping, I would use a while loop. Okay, so I've used a for loop. Now as you can see, my for loop starts at 0, and that will match if we draw an array. You'll remember rightly that the first element in our array is always element 0. And there's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and so on. So my for loop needs to start at 0. It's going to stop when I gets to 30. Okay, so if you think about the end of our array, the last element will be at index 29, and then when we get to 30, we can stop. And we're going to increment our I by 1 every time. So it's going to be 0, 1, 2, and so on. Okay, so that's our for loop, and all we're doing is we're just getting the value from the array. So here I'm getting, if this is the first time the loop is run, I'm going to get element 0. So I'm going to get the value at element 0. I'm going to add that to midday total, which, if we have a look up here, is initialized to 0. So it's going to start at 0. The first time I come in the loop, I'm going to add the midday temperature value to it, and that becomes the new midday total. Okay, and then I do the same with midnight total. So I'm doing exactly the same down here. And then obviously what happens is I go back to the top of my for loop, I add 1 to I, and then I get the next element from my array and add that to my total. I add the next element to my array and add that to the total, and so on until I've added all of the elements in the array to the total. Okay, now once I've added all the elements into the array to the total, I can then calculate the average, as we discussed earlier. That just means taking the total and dividing it by the number of items. Well, we know there are 30 items in the array, and I've done the same here with the midnight average. Again, I've just taken the midnight total and I've divided it by the number of items in the array. Right, and then finally, the final thing I've done in task 2 is the examiner just asked me to display it with a nice message. So I've just displayed here, I've just output here, so this is my output to the user. I've just output that the average temperature at midday was, and tells the user what the average temperature was. and the average temperature at midnight was, and it tells you what the average temperature was. Okay, so that's task 2. This was part 2, and obviously there'll be a part 3 where we talk about task 3. Thank you very much.